education as a social institution and as a social process affects the whole process of social progression and also the technological transformation in the society. These in turn also affect educational institutional arrangement and also its philosophy. Open and distance learning system, which is of very recent origin, is also been affected both by the technological transformation and social progression. These are also in turn affecting the whole process of social progression and technological transformation. What is the state of open and distance learning today? What are its new dimensions? To discuss all these issues in detail, today we are having among us Professor Alan Tate.
Hello.
Who is the Dean of the School of Education and Language in the British Open University. He will be discussing all these issues with us in the studio. Professor Tate, as you have been working in this area of distance education since long, and perhaps you are one of the household name in the circle of distance education today in India, will you please briefly describe the whole process of emergence of open education in the developed part of the world and its gradual expansion in the developing world?
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about this.
Yeah.
I think we have to look at the history of distance education over the last century or more. And there are two strands that we can identify. First of all, in the middle of the 19th century in England, the first correspondence education began. And it began because it was triggered by a very important technical breakthrough, which was the post office. It became possible for the first time to distribute teaching materials to postal addresses all around the country. And the postal service came into existence because of the steam railway, because of the railway system. So technology has been involved in distance education from the very beginning. And what that created, what that allowed, was the establishment of correspondence education as the first, and that really took us through for the first 100 years or more. And correspondence education developed a very bad reputation, and that affects our field of work to this day. And it developed a bad reputation because it appealed to people who were desperate for educational opportunity, but it was based on simply commercial motives. So it didn't offer students real possibilities to succeed in many, many cases. The basic idea was that you took students' fees, and the sooner they dropped out, the better, in fact, because the cheaper it was for you. Alongside that, of course, there was some good work. It would be unfair to say there wasn't. The other very interesting thing that happened at the same time in the UK, although it affected other parts of the world, including India, was the agreement by the University of London in the 1860s that there could be an external degree system. And what this did, which was very interesting for our field, was it broke the link between study and place. Because you could get a degree from the University of London while living in Delhi and never ever go to London in your life. You sat your exams in Delhi, you received the syllabus from the University of London, and you either studied independently or you studied with one of the new tutorial colleges that sprang up to provide services for students. You sat your exams in your own hometown and you got your degree from the University of London. Well, this offered real opportunities, and as I say, it did a very important thing because it broke the link between study and place. And these two traditions went on right through to the 1960s. And in the 1960s in the UK, there was another burst of technologies, in particular television, beginning to take on an educative function. And at the same time, there was a pent-up desire for educational opportunity from people who had never had a chance to study at university. In the UK at that time, something like 6% of people aged 18 went on to study in higher education. So there had been a backlog of educational disadvantage, and the Labour government at the time put together a set of ideas to set up the first Open University, the Open University in the UK, using a combination of media. So we have this story of technology going through as a common thread. And the new technologies at that time were radio and television for educational purposes. And they were combined with print, with teaching materials, and with ideas about student support, with tutorial support. And they grew out, in fact, of this University of London experience where colleges had sprung up to give people both residential and correspondence support in support of London external examinations. So we have two streams then. We have a stream which is largely commercially driven, and then a new intervention in the 1960s leading to the establishment of my university, the Open University in the UK in 1971, which was born out of a number of different sets of motivation. First of all, there was the motivation for individuals, to allow personal development for individuals who had been denied university education. And secondly, there was the government's understanding, and this has a very contemporary sound to it, of the need for a society and an economy to have more educated people in it. This was actually important for national interests. So we have personal, social and economic development as part of the motivation. And so I think what comes into the framework with that first Open University, which of course has seen around the world now so many Open Universities, I think you have more than 20 in India yourselves, with the National Open University, IGNOU, having the senior role. I think we see distance education in that framework as a major development intervention. That is an intervention for social purpose, to try and change the way in which society works, to offer education opportunity, both for reasons of social justice, there's an ethical and a moral dimension about this distance education movement, and for social and economic development. There's a government motivation and a legitimate government motivation too. So that gives you a little history, I think, of correspondence, distance and open education. And the open comes in at the end of this phase of the story because of the impetus for social justice, the sense of opening up institutions, and a sense also, a very real sense, that educational institutions up until that time had not opened themselves up properly, and that there was a need for a radical new kind of intervention into the educational system.
Yeah, thank you. Now, at this stage, as you pointed out, two important things. One is that of I mean, interest motive to get more interest and more income from the student was the earlier kind of a, I mean, kind of requirement of this educational system. The conventional kind of a distance education. Then we find a kind of a technological development. Now, we have come from that kind of a, television stage. Now we are talking about the ICTs, the information and communication technologies. Now this has revolutionized the whole process of delivery mechanism and development of the course material. Now, how do you visualize the role of the open distance education system within this whole system of ICTs and the emergence of this knowledge economy? What kind of role is it's going to play in the societies, both in the developed society and also in the developing societies?
Well, I see some very strong continuities, but also some radical changes. So let's talk about the continuities first. One of the major continuities is that technology has, since the beginnings of the postal system in the 1860s, it's still continuing to revolutionize the way in which educational opportunity can be delivered, and it's changing the way in which learning and teaching can be managed. Both streams, both the commercially minded stream and the what I call the development stream of distance education, are continuing. Sadly, e-learning has also created a whole string of phony institutions who take students' money on false pretenses. I'm afraid that tradition still continues, and one of the important jobs of any government, and I know your government takes this seriously, as does mine, is the management and the control and the regulation of distance education to ensure quality for students and to try and protect the interests of the consumer. Another continuity, I believe, is that the experience of the distance teaching universities, and others of course, because many others have now entered the field, should ensure that the use of technology is pedagogically led, is led for the purposes of learning and teaching, and not technologically driven. So I see some very important continuities. There are some radical changes which are interesting, however. One, first of all, is that while distance education was, if you like, almost a secret methodology that was owned by the distance teaching universities throughout the 1970s and the 1980s and even into the 1990s. Now, of course, it's become widely understood. And some very important things have happened. Firstly, I think many other universities and colleges have understood that adult learners are important and worthwhile learners, whereas up till then, up till the 1970s and 80s, they had been ignored largely. And so many other universities and colleges now want to engage with this audience of learners, and they've begun to use distance teaching also. This is very much the case in the UK, where distance teaching has become a competitive marketplace and no longer the monopoly of the Open University. And that, I think, is one important discontinuity. And it leads to the question, which we might talk about in due course, is what is the role then of a distance teaching university in a world where every university can teach at a distance? But the other discontinuity is that ICT has the capacity to extend access and to increase marginalization. It's a very double-edged policy and a set of technologies. And I suppose it's true, if you see distance education as I do, as a development intervention, that any development intervention not only creates winners, it also creates losers. And I think as we adopt these policies, as we should, I think we have to consider very carefully how marginalization in education is re-articulated. Because in my view, as we see social development happening, marginalization articulates itself again and again and again. And the job, in my view, the continuing job of my view, of an open university is to identify where that educational exclusion and marginalization is taking place. Now for us in the UK, it's not in the same place as it took place in the 1970s. We now have something over 40% of young people going into universities. So it's a huge difference between the 6% only who were going into universities when we started. So we now have to identify, well, who
is the present scenario in India now? Is it 6% go to the higher education?
Okay. Well, I think our histories are very close. They always have been. So we have to think very carefully, who are the new marginalized in the UK? And I think in not many years' time, you will be thinking too about the new kinds of students you need to help. Because if we lose that focus, in my view, on exploring the sorts of people who cannot study, I think we will lose the purpose of having an open university. So as I say, I think there are some radical continuities, some firm continuities, and some radical changes. And the last thing I wanted to say about the ICTs is that one of the very positive things they bring for distance education is that they provide, for the first time, a way for students to talk to each other on a very regular, almost continuous basis through computer conferencing and other such forums. Now, computer conferencing can, like face-to-face teaching, offer very bad practice, but it can also offer very good practice, and it provides a real opportunity for students to participate, to talk to each other across the web, to talk to their tutors across the web, and to give a chance for interaction and participation by our students to a greater extent than we ever had, really, with study centres and students, some students visiting those, but many not.
It's really fascinating when you talk about the whole issue of the marginalization within the distance education system, and also some concern for the marginalized, especially in the Indian context when you talk about the open education system. I mean, open education in particular, not taking the whole distance education within it. Open education itself is specifically mandated to address the need of this marginalized section. Now, we frequently listen about this international collaborations and these regional collaborations for the expansion of the ICTs, etc. like this. Now, how the ICT can be a vehicle for the empowerment of the marginalized through ODL in the developing societies? Can you highlight some of these issues?
Well, I think it can be important for empowering the marginalized, but as I say, it's also double-edged, and I think it could also, and does in some cases, reinforce the marginalization of the excluded. I mean, first of all, I think it is absolutely true that we must bring in as many people as we can to use ICT. It is a necessity for contemporary employment, for all sorts of social skills. Certainly in my own country, there are an increasing number of services which you must access through the web. And so those people who can't, the digitally excluded, are going to find their social exclusion reinforced and made more difficult. So there is a real social job to do in digital literacy, reinforcing digital literacy for the whole population. That's one very important thing. Can you give me the rest of your question again?
Just extending this thing slightly further. I mean, how do you foresee the possibilities of integration of different kind of collaborations, collaboration between this conventional universities educational system and this open university system, and also a kind of integration of conventional technology with that of ICTs to suffice the need of the marginalized. At times, so what we are finding that is open universities are working in isolation. conventional universities are working in isolation because they are having different kind of target group. And ultimately what is happening, those who have been the victims of this so-called futureless development, jobless development and this dark development, and they are again going to be marginalized. So what kind of new collaboration you see, is it possible to bring them in the forefront of this development discourse?
Well, first of all, to talk about cooperation between conventional universities and distance teaching universities. One of the advantages conventional universities have as they begin to approach using ICTs is that they're not encumbered by the baggage of, if you like, what's called second generation distance education, the multimedia distance education that IGNU and the Open University in the UK have both been involved with. So they can move straight into what's called third or even fourth generation distance education without trying to reinvent themselves as we have to do. I think there has been a lot of hype about e-learning. Certainly in my own country and in the States, I think that hype has declined slightly, but there were many new entrants to the education market using e-learning who frankly established systems which were as bad as the old correspondence school mills, and they were as exploitative of students. But I think many universities now have learned that e-learning is a complicated and an expensive business. Nonetheless, it does provide access for students who haven't had access before. And one of the things it leads to, and I think this lies behind your question, I think, is it leads to this scope for international activity by universities. And again, that can be something which is empowering for populations, but also disempowering for populations. I think we have to look at this as a two-sided policy. There can be a simple commercial drive, if you like, selling education into countries which don't have well-developed education systems, which might provide real opportunity for some students, but may have the impact of it fails to embed local capacity. It fails to build capacity in a country to support itself through education. But I think international educational activity, which works in partnership with institutions in a country, can have an educative effect in both directions, I must say, not in just one direction, because I think both partners will learn from the experience. I mean, we are here today because of a major conference at IGNU of international distance educators, more than 400 or 500 people who choose to come together to talk. There is a huge appetite to discover international developments and to learn from each other. So I think educational partnerships is a good framework within which to develop e-supported and e-learning activities on an international scale. Nobody surely would argue against learning from each other internationally. I think, however, that we need to frame our education activities within that ethical dimension of development. So as I say, there can be winners and there can be losers in every policy development.
Another kind of a question that when you were trying to identify certain partners for educational collaboration, at times you are having several kind of partners. Those were the private players. Even the Phoenix is having an university who happens to be the stock market broker. Even Prentice Hall is having one kind of a accreditation system to give different kind of degrees and certificates. The kind of commitment which is expected both from the state and the educational institution, it is seldom missing from their perspective. To have more and more profit is their kind of a concern. So what kind of measure one should take while entering into collaboration of this kind of institution at the international level?
Well, I think life has become much more complicated. It is absolutely the case that education providers are becoming much more widely dispersed amongst different sorts of organizations. So it is absolutely true that along with the organizations that have grown up as state-funded organizations over, say, the last 50 years or so in all our societies, there are now a range of new entrants. Private companies, major companies, big international companies, voluntary organizations also, major voluntary organizations. So I see it necessary to manage partnerships across those three sorts of sectors at least. The not-for-profit education sector, the for-profit sector, which has its own interests, and the voluntary sector, the voluntary organizations, the non-governmental organizations who express other sorts of motivations, perhaps in particular from civic society. managing these partnerships is complex. I don't think there can be a general rule. I think what is crucial is to try and establish the purpose of the educational intervention. I have to say that there are some private companies who have very laudable major social programs, community programs, and there are other big international companies which don't seem to have such ethical purposes. So I think one has to look at each case by case and try and invent across partnerships, try and be clear about what the purposes are in that partnership.
Exactly. Now I'll go to another side of this discussion, especially with the proliferation of this educational lead and this lifelong learning. We find there's enormous demand for this open and distance education, propagated course material and these programs. But the number of the people, those who are trained to develop this open and distance material learning is very, very limited in terms of the requirement. Now what is happening within this given scenario, the academics, especially of the third world countries, they are highly involved in the designing and development of these courses. And the kind of research they should have been undertaking, both in the system and in the discipline, at times those are missing. Until unless there is a serious kind of commitment to their own discipline missing. But I find a kind of a contrast to the UKOU. I find that some of the name like yours, the Alan Tate is a big name in the distance education. Stuart Hall is a big name in the sociological studies. Similarly, Ben Crow is another name in the development studies. And what kind of framework you have developed so that you have been able to find up a quality course material which has got worldwide recognition? Simultaneously, they are also involved in the research activities. How have you been able to create that kind of a space, that kind of environment where this discipline-based research and this course development has been integrated together?
Yes, that's not an easy question to answer. In my own university, the Open University in the UK, we have had a great deal of pressure to create our teaching materials, to create our courses. And for many academics, this has impacted negatively on their capacity for research. So there is a constant battle to fight for time for research. This is, of course, true in many conventional universities where people are teaching regular classes, and they too have pressures. But I think in the first 15 or 20 years of an open university's life, it is trying to work so hard to create its courses and to create its programs that it's a big development phase. But I think it's very important to create time for research. I think it is true for all universities, but it's no less true for an open university that the best teaching is going to be informed by the best research, and that your teachers who are able to offer to students an understanding of the contemporary cutting-edge development of their subjects are going to give the quality education which distance students are entitled to expect no less than any other students. And I have to tell you that some of the recent statistics about the Open University in my country have been very encouraging indeed. We now have, for better or worse, league tables of teaching quality in British universities. And the Open University was, I think, 7th in its place, very high indeed on the list, and has just recently been voted top of all British universities in terms of student satisfaction. So I think we have to balance the needs of teaching with the needs of research. The needs of teaching, top quality teaching for our students, is what our students are entitled to expect. But I think research contributes to that. And that's the best way, I think, to try and persuade ourselves as academics that we have to fight for time for research. It actually helps our students.
How do we react to this situation that we are talking about? We are not only in a globalized era, but also we are located within the whole core of a knowledge economy, the way it is being evolving. Also, we are guided by the whole kind of a situation prescribed by the GATS and other kind of a thing. So what kind of liberty or kind of autonomy an educational institution like any open university can exercise while designing the courses? What kind of commitment they should have, and what kind of commitment they should have, especially for the societal need, commitment towards the market? I mean, what kind of commitment, how they can make a balance between these two?
Yes, what a good question. I don't think there's any doubt that internationalization of education is happening. Globalization is a phenomenon which is taking place. So
what do you say? It's a phenomenon, it's not a choice.
It is, absolutely. There's no way that we can hide from it. It's happening. The responsibility, however, to manage it for the best purposes is very clearly our responsibility, and that is absolutely crucial. Now, we talked a little earlier about ways in which international trade in education, if we use that term, can disempower a society. And I think it's very important that through working in partnership, we prevent that happening. So I think that's the fundamental responsibility on any education institution working internationally. IGNU, I know, has very substantial international work. I think you work in more than 35 countries and have a major policy for Africa. So you will be facing these issues just as we are. And it's very good that these issues are being faced not just simply in the north of the hemisphere, but also north-south. I think it's very good that we all share these questions. But I think I think the crucial thing to remember is that these development interventions take place within a trade framework, but they're not for the purpose of profit. And I think there's a very good phrase which I learned from a senior manager in my university, who said we should be business-like, but we don't exist for business purposes. And I think that is a very good thing to try and remember. Our purpose is educational, and education is for the purpose of personal development and social and economic development.
Just another dimension, just to adding to it, is that when you were talking about the kind of one's professional commitment to distance education, and also we find similar kind of commitment on the part of this conventional education. They're having different kind of professional commitment. Also, we find the research organization are having different kind of commitments. How do you foresee kind of integrating all this kind of commitment together for a common goal? Is it possible?
Well, I think it is possible, but I think it's contested and difficult from time to time. It's absolutely true that a teacher in a university has a commitment to students, to one's peers, to one's academic community, sometimes to a professional community. If you take academics who are architects or engineers or accountants, they will have a commitment to their professional community also. But I think the fundamental commitment, but maybe this is a personal thing, is to one's university's purpose. So I remain very interested in purposes. And as a dean, I find myself in discussion with colleagues, and the question that I often come back to people for is, yes, but what is the purpose of this activity? What are we trying to achieve? And then I think we begin to frame our social and our ethical and our moral values. And those are what I think should drive our activities.
Now, widely what we have visualized that education system has influenced the whole kind of technological transformation and also kind of a political articulation of a country. And what I told initially at the beginning, that is even the education, all those processes also influence this educational system. Now, if we put the ODL as a case, how far it has been able to emerge as a force to affect the policies regarding education, policies regarding social development, or it has remained only as a tool to be guided by the desire of the state, desire of the dominant civil society organizations, or maybe desire by the multinational organizations, of the market forces in that sense?
Well, it's certainly true that if you have a major university like IGNU or like my own university, which is considerably smaller than IGNU, I should add, it is inevitably going to reflect the interests of the state. And in one sense that's perfectly healthy. If the state is democratically elected and democratically sustained as India and the UK are, then in one sense that's perfectly proper. But in another sense, a university must of course have independence from the state in any immediate sense. So I think sustaining that independence is important. Where it's difficult, where it becomes contested, is to try and ensure that the educational purposes of the university are those which are at the forefront. There is a tendency sometimes in many organisations, and I'm afraid universities aren't exempt from them, for academics to sometimes seek to define their purposes largely in terms of their own interests. And so I think we have to try and always reach out to see what are the purposes of the organisation, what are we trying to achieve. And where we have legitimate individual interests as workers in the university, of course we do. But I think we should try and articulate the interests of our organisation in order to do our best.
Yes, today we had a whole range of discussion on the distance education today. And we started with the whole issue of the emergence of distance and open learning, its evolution throughout the history, a process of integration of the system with the ICT, with the market, with the state, also its role in terms of the social well-being of the marginalized, also its role for the promotion of the market and otherwise. To have all this discussion with us, we had Professor Alan Tate, who is one of the luminaries of the distance education system in the world today, and we are really very happy to have a nice discussion with him. I believe all of you have been benefited with his discussion. Thank you, Professor Tate, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.